He had already served a year in the citadel for attempted murder. He could not visit her because she lived in her mother-in-law's house, so she came to see him. That night, in a jealous fit, he had beaten her and placed his revolver at her temple. To make a long story short, she had managed to grab her coat and run out of his apartment. She had knocked on the doors of the neighbors, but none of them would let her in, and so she had made her way to the attic. "Madam," I said to her, "your lover is probably still looking for you. Supposing he finds you? I am no longer what one might call a knight." "He won't dare make a disturbance," she said. "He's on parole. I'm through with him for good. Have pity. Please don't put me out in the middle of the night." "How will you get home tomorrow?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "I'm tired of life anyhow, but I don't want to be killed by him." "Well, I won't be able to sleep in any case," I said. "Take my bed, and I will rest here in this chair." "No, I wouldn't do that. You are not young, and you don't look very well. Please go back to bed, and I will sit here." We haggled so long, we finally decided to lie down together. "You have nothing to fear from me," I assured her. "I am old and helpless with women." She seemed completely convinced. What was I saying? Yes, suddenly I find myself in bed with a countess whose lover might break down the door at any moment. I covered us both with the 2 blankets I have, and didn't bother to build the usual cocoon of odds and ends. I was so wrought up I forgot about the cold. Besides, I felt her closeness. A strange warmth emanated from her body, different from any I had known, or perhaps I had forgotten it. Was my opponent trying a new gambit? In the past few years he had stopped playing with me in earnest. You know there is such a thing as humorous chess. I have been told that Nimtsovich often played jokes on his partners. In the old days, Murphy was known as a chess prankster. "A fine move," I said to my adversary, "a masterpiece." With that I realized that I knew who her lover was. I had met him on the stairs. A giant of a man with the face of a murderer. What a funny end for Jacques Cohn, to be finished off by a Polish Othello. I began to laugh, and she joined in. I embraced her and held her close. She did not resist. Suddenly, a miracle happened. I was a man again. Once on a Thursday evening I stood near a slaughterhouse in a small village and saw a bull and cow copulate before they were going to be slaughtered for the Sabbath. Why she consented I will never know. Perhaps it was a way of taking revenge on her lover. She kissed me and whispered endearments. Then we heard heavy footsteps. Someone pounded on the door with his fist. My girl rolled off the bed and lay on the floor. I wanted to recite the prayer for the dying, but I was ashamed before God, and not so much before God as before my mocking opponent. Why grant him this additional pleasure? Even melodrama has its limits. The brute behind the door continued beating it, and I was astounded that it did not give way. He kicked it with his foot. The door creaked but held. I was terrified, yet something in me could not help laughing. Then the racket stopped. Othello had left. Next morning I took the Countess's bracelet to a pawn shop. With the money I received, I bought my heroine a dress, underwear, and shoes. The dress didn't fit, neither did the shoes, but all she needed to do was get to a taxi, provided, of course, that her lover did not waylay her on the steps. Curious, but the man vanished that night and never reappeared. Before she left, she kissed me and urged me to call her. But I'm not that much of a fool. As the Talmud says, a miracle doesn't happen every day. And you know, Kafka, young as he was possessed by the same inhibitions that plague me in my old age. They impeded him in everything he did, in sex as well as in his writing. He craved love and fled from it. He wrote a sentence and immediately crossed it out. Otto Weininger was like that too, mad and a genius. I met him in Vienna. He spouted aphorisms and paradoxes. One of his sayings I will never forget. God did not create the bedbug. You have to know Vienna to really understand these words. Yet who did create the bedbug? There's Bamberg. Look at the way he waddles along on his short legs, a corpse refusing to rest in its grave. It might be a good idea to start a club for insomniac corpses. Why does he prowl around all night? What good are the cabarets to him? The doctors gave him up years ago when we were still in Berlin. Not that it prevented him from sitting in the Romanisches Café until 4 o'clock in the morning, chatting with the prostitutes. Once Granat, the actor, announced that he was giving a party, a real orgy, at his house, and among others he invited Bamberg. Granat instructed each man to bring a lady, either his wife or a friend, but Bamberg had neither wife nor mistress, and so he paid a harlot to accompany him. He had to buy her an evening dress for the occasion. The company consisted exclusively of writers, professors, philosophers, and the usual intellectual hangers-on. They all had the same idea as Bamberg. They hired prostitutes. I was there, too. I escorted an actress from Prague, whom I had known a long time. Do you know Granat? A savage. He drinks cognac like soda water, and can eat an omelet of 10 eggs. As soon as the guests arrived, he stripped and began dancing madly around with the whores, just to impress his highbrow visitors. At first, the intellectuals sat on chairs and stared. After a while, they began to discuss sex. Schopenhauer said this, Nietzsche said that. Anyone who hadn't witnessed it would find it difficult to imagine how ridiculous such geniuses can be. In the midst of it all, Bamberg was taken ill. He turned as green as grass and broke out in a sweat. "Jacques," he said, "I'm finished. A good place to die." He was having a kidney or a gallbladder attack. I half carried him out and got him to a hospital. "By the way, can you lend me a zloty?" 2. "What? Have you robbed Bank Polski?" "I sold a story." "Congratulations! Let's have supper together. You will be my guest." Chapter 2. While we were eating, Bamberg came over to our table. He was a little man, emaciated as a consumptive, bent over and bow-legged. He was wearing patent leather shoes and spats. On his pointed skull lay a few gray hairs. One eye was larger than the other, red, bulging, frightened by its own vision. He leaned against our table on his bony little hands and said in his cackling voice, "Jacques, yesterday I read your Kafka's Castle. Interesting, very interesting, but what is he driving at? It's too long for a dream. Allegories should be short." Jacques Cohn quickly swallowed the food he was chewing. "Sit down," he said. "A master does not have to follow the rules." "There are some rules even a master must follow. No novel should be longer than War and Peace. Even War and Peace is too long. If the Bible consisted of 18 volumes, it would long since have been forgotten. The Talmud has 36 volumes, and the Jews have not forgotten it. Jews remember too much. That is our misfortune. It is 2,000 years since we were driven out of the Holy Land, and now we are trying to get back in. Insane, isn't it? If our literature would only reflect this insanity, it would be great. But our literature is uncannily sane. Well, enough of that." Bamberg straightened himself, scowling with the effort. With his tiny steps he shuffled away from the table. He went over to the gramophone and put on a dance record. It was known in the Writers' Club that he had not written a word in years. In his old age he was learning to dance, influenced by the philosophy of his friend Dr. Mitskin, the author of The Entropy of Reason. In this book, Dr. Mitskin attempted to prove that the human intellect is bankrupt, and that true wisdom can only be reached through passion. Jacques Cohn shook his head. Half-pint Hamlet. Kafka was afraid of becoming a Bamberg. That is why he destroyed himself. "Did the Countess ever call you?" I asked. Jacques Cohn took his monocle out of his pocket and put it in its place. "And what if she did? In my life everything turns into words, all talk, talk. This is actually Dr. Mitskin's philosophy. Man will end up as a word machine. He will eat words, drink words, marry words, poison himself with words." Come to think of it, Dr. Mitskin was also present at Granat's orgy. He came to practice what he preached. But he could just as well have written The Entropy of Passion. Yes, the Countess does call me from time to time. She, too, is an intellectual, but without intellect. As a matter of fact, although women do their best to reveal the charms of their bodies, they know just as little about the meaning of sex as they do about the intellect. Take Madame Seachik. What did she ever have except a body? But just try asking her what a body really is. Now she's ugly. When she was an actress in the Prague days, she still had something. I was her leading man. She was a tiny little talent. We came to Prague to make some money and found a genius waiting for us. Homo sapiens in his highest degree of self-torture. Kafka wanted to be a Jew, but he didn't know how. He wanted to live, but he didn't know this either. Franz, I said to him once, you are a young man. Do what we all do. There was a brothel I knew in Prague, and I persuaded him to go there with me. He was still a virgin. I'd rather not speak about the girl he was engaged to. He was sunk to the neck in the bourgeois swamp. The Jews of his circle had one ideal, to become Gentiles, and not Czech Gentiles, but German Gentiles. To make it short, I talked him into the adventure. I took him to a dark alley in the former ghetto, and there was the brothel. We went up the crooked steps. I opened the door, and it looked like a stage set. The whores, the pimps, the guests, the madam. I will never forget that moment. Kafka began to shake and pulled at my sleeve. Then he turned and ran down the steps so quickly I was afraid he would break a leg. Once on the street he stopped and vomited like a schoolboy. On the way back we passed an old synagogue, and Kafka began to speak about the golem. Kafka believed in the golem, and even that the future might well bring another one. There must be magic words that can turn a piece of clay into a living being. Did not God, according to the Kabbalah, create the world by uttering holy words? In the beginning was the Logos. Yes, it's all one big chess game. All my life I've been afraid of death, but now that I'm on the threshold of the grave, I've stopped being afraid. It's clear my partner wants to play a slow game. He'll go on taking my pieces one by one. First, he removed my appeal as an actor and turned me into a so-called writer. He'd no sooner done that than he provided me with writer's cramp. His next move was to deprive me of my potency, yet I know he's far from checkmate, and this gives me strength. It's cold in my room. Let it be cold. I have no supper. I won't die without it. He sabotages me, and I sabotage him. Some time ago I was returning home late at night. The frost burned outside, and suddenly I realized that I had lost my key. I woke up the janitor, but he had no spare key. He stank of vodka, and his dog bit my foot. In former years I would have been desperate, but this time I said to my opponent, if you want me to catch pneumonia, it's all right with me. I left the house and decided to go to the Vienna station. The wind almost carried me away. I would have had to wait at least 3/4 of an hour for the streetcar at that time of night. I passed by the Actors' Union and saw a light in a window. I decided to go in. Perhaps I could spend the night there. On the steps I hit something with my shoe and heard a ringing sound. I bent down and picked up a key. It was mine. The chance of finding a key on the dark stairs of this building is 1 in a billion. But it seems that my opponent was afraid I might give up the ghost before he was ready. Fatalism? Call it fatalism if you like. Jacques Cohn rose and excused himself to make a phone call. I sat there and watched Bamberg dancing on his shaky legs with a literary lady. His eyes were closed, and he leaned his head on her bosom as if it were a pillow. He seemed to be dancing and sleeping simultaneously. Jacques Cohn took a long time, much longer than it normally takes to make a phone call. When he returned, the monocle in his eyes shone. Guess who is in the other room, he said. Madame Schisik, Kafka's great love. Really? I told you about her. Come, I'd like to introduce you to her. No. Why not? A woman that was loved by Kafka is worth meeting. I'm not interested. You are shy, that's the truth. Kafka, too, was shy as a yeshiva student. I was never shy, and that may be the reason I have never amounted to anything. My dear friend, I need another 20 groschen for the janitors, 10 for the one in this building and 10 for the one in mine. Without the money, I can't go home. I took some change out of my pocket and gave it to him. So much? You certainly must have robbed a bank today. 46 groschen. Piff-puff. Well, if there is a God, he will reward you. And if there isn't, who is playing all these games with Jacques Cohn? Translated by the author and Elizabeth Shube. In my father's court. My My father's friend. Often I hear Yiddish writers speak of publishing a book. Terms like matrices, composition, plates, and stock are used. But to me these words have been familiar from childhood. Since my father was the author of numerous religious books, I learned early how a book is set in type, how galleys are proofread, matrices struck, plates made, and all about printing and binding. No matter how little my father earned, he saved money to publish his books. He used to say, "A religious book is a permanent testament." I remember him also preparing for publication a manuscript of the famous Yosef Shor. It was discovered somewhere in a library, a notebook with yellow-gray paper and faded characters, but the writing, although 150 years old, was still legible. Its title was Nutrikun, and like all Shor's works, it was written in a difficult literary style. My father and his good friend Reb Nachman, known for his own rabbinical books, copied the old manuscript for the printer. I loved to be present when Father and Reb Nachman conversed. They both had red beards and blue eyes, but Reb Nachman was a kind of Hasidic dandy, with a dazzling alpaca capote, gold-rimmed glasses dangling from a black ribbon, and polished boots. A fine, intelligent person of good heritage, Reb Nachman was a disciple of Rabbi Tzadok Lubliner, whose numerous religious books he kept editing and publishing. Father enjoyed the wit of Reb Nachman, who in turn was pleased with Father's gentle speech. On the other hand, Reb Nachman also resented the Radzimin rabbi for whom he had worked some years before. Reb Nachman conducted himself like a scholar and aristocrat. Unfortunately, his writing and editing brought him nothing, and if his son did not make and sell cigarettes, Reb Nachman and his family would have starved. It was illegal to sell cigarettes without a stamp signifying that they had been taxed, but they had no other source of livelihood. The boy sold the cigarettes to stores who resold them. One day, for some reason or other, my father sent me to Reb Nachman. The apartment, different from ours, was somehow similar. There were more children and more furniture. Reb Nachman, who had a talent for drawing, not only would print and draw beautifully, but would embellish a title page with all kinds of flowers, circles, and flourishes. He sat at a table in a skullcap and satin vest, with colored slate pencils and bottles of ink before him. Since Reb Nachman visited Father more often than Father visited him, I was welcomed warmly and addressed as a grown-up. Having heard that my brother Israel Joshua had become corrupted, he discussed heresy with me. There he showed me a piece of paper covered with flowers, lions, small birds, and eagles. "Look," he said, "if someone told you this had drawn itself, you'd say he was crazy. But the heretics say the world created itself, and is that sane? Certainly not. Man, they say, comes from the ape, but did the ape come from itself? No. They say the earth tore itself from the sun. Well, where did the sun come from? They say all kinds of nonsensical things to keep from admitting that there is a creator." I blushed. Such things were never discussed directly with me, a mere boy at home. Reb Nachman was treating me like an equal. I was offered a glass of tea and a cookie. A girl my age, with dark braids, came in, and then another girl. I smelled cutlets frying in the kitchen. This apartment didn't seem as bare as ours. Everything harmonized. The Torah, wise words, girls, tasty dishes, a table full of pencils, inks, brushes, and seals. And what Reb Nachman had to say about heretics was revealing to me, since I had wondered for a long time what their views were. Suddenly there was a loud knocking on the front door, then noise and harsh voices. Reb Nachman leaped from his chair, and I arose, frightened by a strange sight. The kitchen was full of policemen, officers in brass buttons with crowns on their caps. Cap in hand, the janitor followed them, and there was even a civilian official, a secret agent. From the way the Russians, whom I did not understand, yelled and stamped and gripped their swords, I realized it was a raid. Reb Nachman grew white, and his frightened daughters huddled in a corner. His wife was arguing and pleading, but the police shouted at her to be quiet. A tremor ran down my spine. Terrified, I asked Reb Nachman if I could go home. "If they let you," he said in a confused way. I was stopped at the door by a guard. I had no knowledge of Reb Nachman's illegal business, and I stood there trembling. Just a while ago, my friend Baruch David and I had seen the Paviak prison. The yellow walls, the barred windows with wire mesh across the bars, the sallow-faced prisoners peering out, and the black entrance gates. I felt as if my time had come now. I, as well as Reb Nachman and his family, would be sent to jail to rot behind the thick walls. But why should this happen to me? And what did they have against Reb Nachman? Had he been falsely accused? I remembered the story of Rabbi Akiba, whose body had been raked with metal combs until he expired. Was that to be my fate? Had the era of Khmelnytsky returned, or the time when the temple was destroyed? I wished I could suddenly sprout a couple of wings and soar off through the window, or grow as strong as Samson and smite these Philistines with the jawbone of an ass, or wear a hat that would make me invisible. I hadn't been arrested yet, but my desire for freedom became so potent that I wondered what I had been missing until then. What had I worried about when it was possible to walk the streets unmolested? Everything became inexpressibly dear to me. The Warsaw streets, our home, the summer day. I felt as if I were suffocating. As I looked fearfully at the swords, epaulets, whistles, and medals, if there is a God, I thought, why is he silent? The police stopped talking and began to search the apartment. At first they found nothing, then suddenly began to drag out cartons of cigarettes, cigarette paper, tobacco, and other things wrapped in paper. As if this wasn't enough, the agent brought in a crowbar and wrenched a board from the floor. It happened to be the right board, because all kinds of boxes wrapped in paper were revealed. "Someone informed," Reb Nachman called out. "Be quiet," a policeman ordered. During the search, which took about 3 hours, I almost passed out from sweating. My shirt was drenched, and rivulets ran over my entire body. The policemen laughed, seeing me so soaked, and one of them seized my sidelock to find his hand wet. I was melting from anxiety. It seemed to me that I would soon dissolve completely. Reb Nachman's daughters, despite the trouble in the family, looked at me and smiled. I kept trembling with fear and shame, even when the sweating stopped. These Russians, with their swords, revolvers, mean speech, and coarse jokes, aroused hostility in me that I had never before felt toward anyone. Eventually, Reb Nachman's son came home, took the Russians into the bedroom, and came to some agreement with them. No one was taken to jail, and I had been afraid for no reason at all. After the police left, Reb Nachman clutched his beard and said, "You see where they've got us? It's high time the Messiah came." They insisted that I eat something else, but all I wanted to do was get away. I felt sickened by the experience. I had already heard my brother say that Polish Jews were storekeepers, brokers, idlers, and parasites, and that there were more stores than customers. The fathers-in-law starved in order to board their sons-in-law. My brother referred to Palestine, where Jews led normal lives as farmers. He also had socialistic leanings and complained that those who worked hard had nothing, while the idle never lacked money. He had told Mother about the Bilgorai sieve makers, who toiled in their shops all week and had to beg on Fridays. If only they'd strike, my brother said, the bosses would have to give in. Even my mother, after her return from my sister's wedding in Berlin, spoke in a manner that was strange for her. "In Germany," she said, "people are polite. The police say please and excuse me to everyone. And the border officials did not tear up our things, but addressed Father as Herr Rabbiner." My brain was whirling with such information. I walked, seething, through the streets, my brother's words mixing with my own thoughts. No, life in Poland was shameful. With new insight I observed Warsaw's Jews. Tiny shops, ragged men, grimy children, slatternly women. The voice of the Torah arose from houses of prayer and study houses, but they were surrounded by Poles, Russians, innumerable Gentiles who hated Jews and considered them a burden. The Jews had one protector, God. But what if the heretics were right? Dreamers. How does a livelihood start? With a family, a wife and children. Why doesn't a bachelor earn enough? He doesn't have a family. Even if he works, he scarcely earns enough to support himself. Rich men have wives and children. Without a wife, a man is half a person. I don't know how many times I've wanted to go into business, but when I get up and look around the house, it's as if my hands were paralyzed." Reb Ezekiel, a short, stocky man with a partly gray beard, was speaking. Behind gold-rimmed glasses, his eyes were soft and moist. He wore a gabardine with tails, a silk hat, and polished boots. It wasn't that Reb Ezekiel was a bachelor. He was married for the 3rd time, but she was a bad wife, and having such a wife is like having none at all. "It's like this," he said. "When I come home from evening prayers and want to sit down with a book, she wants to go to bed. I can't go to sleep at 9. I toss and turn all night. At 4 in the morning she's up to tend her fish with a lot of noise, waking me when she lights the gas. While she and her daughter fumble with the tanks where the fish are, she curses continually. Then they go off without even leaving me a warm drink. At night they're frozen and grouchy and go right to bed. Is this a home? What am I there for except to make a benediction over the wine on the Sabbath? She'd like me to care for the fish too. No, this is no home." "Well, why not divorce her?" people would say. "She doesn't want a divorce. Besides, how would I support myself? I'd have to be able to earn a living." "Then what can be done? Now you know why I'm so miserable." He used to visit our house, drink tea, and have a bit of food. He taught me to play chess and liked to invent things. His pockets were filled with strings, springs, little discs, spindles, wire fragments, and other items used for his inventions. Having studied books on the subject, he already knew how to make ink and salves. Everything fascinated him. Why summer was hot and winter cold, why ice formed from water and later dissolved, why the ancient Egyptians were conversant with a magic unknown to moderns, and what countries lay beyond America, China, and the mountains of darkness. How could such a man who was always looking into books fool around with fish? How could he be expected to stand in Janusz's bazaar among the boors and simpletons, selling carp or pike to housewives? If he had a household to call his own, it might have been different. Others in similar situations visited us also, with their real or fancied tragedies. One who came often was Matis, whom I remembered from Leontzin. The son-in-law of Hirschel the dairyman, he used to visit the court of the Radzimin rabbi. Short and thick-set, with large hands and feet and an amiable, naive face, he, like my father, had devoted his life to being a good Jew. He was always talking about rabbis and saints. It took him 3 hours to say the morning prayer. He had no time to work. His father-in-law, Hirschel, had tried vainly to make a merchant of him. After the morning prayer, Matis would eat a piece of bread with onion and sit down to study. There was so much to study that he could not understand how anyone could devote himself to anything else. So many prayers, Hasidic books, so many degrees of piety to be reached, and one had to be constantly on guard against all the devils and goblins that tried to drag one down. How was it possible to take the time to work in a store, or care for cattle, or worry about the dairy and such matters? Hirschel wanted his daughter to divorce Matis, but Leah, who had a couple of children, wouldn't hear of it. She had remained in Leontzin with her father, while Matis wandered about Warsaw. Suddenly, he announced that he had become an Uman Chassid. For years he had searched for a true saint, and now he had found Uman Chassidim, and Rabbi Nachman from Uman was the greatest. No Chassidic book, he said, could match Rabbi Nachman's collected wisdom, his tales and prayers, so full of the mysteries of the Kabbalah. Matis threw himself entirely into Uman Chassidim. Coming to see us, without any introduction, he would begin to dance, snapping his fingers and quoting his saint. "There is no gloom. Until the coming of the Messiah, my flame will smolder." All Matis longed for was to go to Uman in the Ukraine and spend his time studying in the house of worship that stood over the rabbi's grave. As a Kohen of priestly descent, Matis was not permitted to enter a cemetery, but the graves of saints he knew did not defile. Nevertheless, Matis needed train fare. He also wanted to take Leah and the children, but his father-in-law would not permit it. What would they live on out there in Russia? Mates's dance steps on the rabbi's grave? Both Ezekiel and Mates were dreamers, but they didn't understand each other. Mates, looking heavenwards, would dance, clapping his hands and crying that the world was full of joy, while Ezekiel, scratching his beard, would ask, "Where does the hail come from? And if it's warm in summer, how does the rain freeze? It's cold up there. If it's so cold, why doesn't it snow? And what's wrong with hail in winter? There must be some answer to this." "Everything comes from above," Mates said bluntly. "For everything there is a guardian angel. Each blade of grass is told when to grow." "Yes, but there must be a law governing all this." Mates managed to get the train fare and went to Uman, not to stay, merely to look it over. Many months later he came back with his clothes in tatters, his cheeks sunken, and his boots cracked. But his eyes were radiant, and he came dancing into our house. When Father asked how things went in Uman, Mates talked and sang and rejoiced. "It's paradise," he said, growing more excited as he spoke. The saint's house of worship overlooked his grave, Mates said. His spirit hovered everywhere, blazing from every candle. The days, weeks, and months went by as one studied from the rabbi's books, sang and rejoiced. Stepping into the house of worship, one was immediately overcome with feeling of love for every man and child. When there was food, one ate. When there was nothing, one fasted. And one slept in the house of worship above the rabbi's grave. Aren't people afraid? Afraid of the rabbi? Ridiculous. Only villains remain dead. A saint really comes to life when he dies. The rabbi walks through the house of worship, speaks to us, recites the Torah. All the pleasures in the world are nothing compared to one day in Uman. Even if they offered me Rothschild's millions, I wouldn't stay away from the rabbi. Mates had come for his family, but Hirschel consulted Father about a divorce. Leah accompanied him crying, and bringing along with her the smell of the village and dairy. "Why can't we live like other people?" she asked, weeping copiously. I don't recall exactly, but I think that Mates, although he finally divorced Leah, remained in Poland. He returned to Uman only after the Bolshevik Revolution, smuggling himself across borders, past armies, hostile bands, and pogroms. I do not know what happened to him there. He may have ended up in a slave camp or Bolshevik prison. The Bolsheviks, who had not molested the house of worship at first, eventually destroyed it. Ezekiel and Mates weren't the only dreamers to visit us. Father seemed to attract these men as a candle does moths. A short, stout young man with a blond beard came to see us from some Polish village after deserting his wife and perhaps even child. He carried a prayer shawl and phylacteries, and in his prayer shawl sack there was a book called The Sayings of the Holy Jew. He had come to Warsaw to study the Kabbalah, he said, having been forbidden to do so in his hometown. After asking everywhere in Warsaw about a rabbi who could help him, he was directed to my father. The young man would not listen to my father's pleas that he abandon his plan, saying that he himself knew nothing of the Kabbalah. The young man thought Father was merely being modest. Father gave him several books: The Pillar of Service, The Treasure of Dew, The Gates of Light, and the young man settled down in our house to study. Sleeping in Father's study, he ate breakfast and supper with us. To Mother's complaints that she didn't have enough for her own children, Father replied, "I won't turn away a fellow Jew." To earn his keep, the young man was asked to teach me the Torah. He locked himself in the bedroom with me, and we studied. In the midst of studying, he said, "What's to become of us?" "What do you mean? How long do you think we'll sit here like this?" "What else should we do? Go away?" "Where?" "Wherever our legs take us." "How will we live?" "He who gives life will sustain us." He longed for the days when a young man could settle in a rabbi's house and immerse himself in Judaism, renouncing the world. He suggested that we both become saints. There must still be saintly Jews in the world, if not in Poland, then at least in the Holy Land. In Jerusalem or Safed, there had to be Jews studying the Kabbalah. Somewhere in a cave we'll settle down and live an eternal day of atonement, fasting by day and eating at night.
No one needs money there. When you're hungry, you eat the St. John's bread that grows everywhere. There are yeshivas where one can devote oneself to study. I asked how we would travel, and he said, On foot. To Palestine? Why not? Do you know the way? Yes, one goes to Istanbul. Even though I knew I wouldn't leave my home to hike to Istanbul with this fellow, I was enchanted with the idea. I would become a second Rabbi Isaac Luria, or Chaim Vital. At night, the prophet Elijah and I would study the Torah together. My soul would ascend to heaven every night. I would visit all the mansions, the bird's nest, the mansion of the Messiah, would speak to angels, and learn how to perform miracles. Like King Solomon, I would understand the speech of devils, woodcocks, and elephants. Maybe I myself might even become the Messiah. At the gates of Rome, binding my wounds, I would hear a voice call out, Isaac, you are the Messiah. Then, mounting an ass, I would ride to Jerusalem. One day a telegram came for the young man. It said, Come at once, your wife is dead. Wringing her hands, Mother said, He's to blame for her death. People like him are murderers. When the young man learned the news, he asked, When do I tear a rent in my clothes? Father gave him train fare, and he went away saying he would return. But he never did, and I was left with a longing for distant places, mysterious saints, and caves where Kabbalists in white silk gabardines ponder the secrets of the Torah. A wedding. Krachmalna Street had many houses of ill repute. That is, they were houses only in a manner of speaking. Actually, the prostitutes occupied basements, whose small windows were often lower than the entrance. The men who patronized them had to climb through dark, cave-like corridors. Outside on the square that served as the thieves' hangout, the pimps also used to congregate. Even then, I already knew that there were whores, and that it is forbidden to look at them, for the mere sight of them is defiling. But just what they did I had not yet figured out. Often I saw them standing by the gates or on the square, their cheeks smeared with rouge, their eyes underlined with black shadows, wearing flower-printed shawls and red or blue shoes. Occasionally one would be smoking a cigarette. When I passed by, they would call after me, Hey there, pious little ninny! Hey, you thief of a Hasid! Moon calf! Once one gave me a piece of chocolate. I started to run and threw it into the gutter. I knew that whatever they had touched was impure. Yet sometimes they would come to ask my father ritual questions. Whenever one of them entered our door, Mother became embarrassed and tongue-tied. But my father knew no distinction. He averted his eyes from all females. Their questions inevitably concerned the observance of a yortzeit, the anniversary of a parent's death. This was the only religious practice they observed, but they could never calculate the proper day for lighting the memorial candle. One day a young man who had the appearance of an artisan came to our house. He wore the traditional cap, but a modern short jacket and buttoned shoes. He wore no collar, only a paper shirt front fastened with a tin collar pin. He was unshaven, his cheeks were hollow, his crooked nose pale as though he had recently been ill. He had dark eyes whose mildness made me think of fast days and funerals. Their expression was like that of mourners who came to ask questions concerning the observance of the periods of mourning. Mother happened to be in the study, and I too was sitting there over a volume of the Gemara, pretending to study. "What good news do you bring?" asked my father. The young man began to mumble and alternately blushed and grew pale. "Rabbi, is one permitted to marry a prostitute?" My mother was dumbfounded. Father quietly asked the young man some questions and threw a stern glance at me. "Leave the room." I went out to the kitchen, and the young man remained in the study for some time. After a while, Mother came into the kitchen and said, "There are all sorts of lunatics in this world." Father's decision was that such a marriage was permissible. Indeed, it was a deed of piety to rescue a Jewish girl from a sinful life. The young man waited to hear no more. He immediately made arrangements for Father to perform the marriage. Then he rushed out, letting the door slam shut behind him. Father came into the kitchen. "What kind of madness is that?" my mother asked. "He is, as they say, in love." "With a prostitute?" "No," and father returned to his books. I do not remember how much time elapsed before the wedding. The girl had to prepare herself to go to the ritual bath. The women of the neighborhood began to busy themselves about her. The entire street knew of the affair, and it was discussed at the grocer's, in the butcher shop, even in the synagogues. The weddings in our house were usually quiet affairs attended by a few people. Most of the time, my father had to ask some people in the prayer house to make up the mandatory quorum of 10 men. But this time our house took on the appearance of the Viennese ballroom. Every minute the door opened and another thief or pimp entered. Most of the guests were prostitutes adorned in silk and velvet and wearing hats bedecked with ostrich feathers. That a respectable young man had fallen in love with a whore was a victory for the underworld, especially for its women. It was an omen that there was hope even for them, the outcasts. The madams wore the matrons' wigs and shawls that they reserved for the synagogue on the high holy days. The streetwalkers wore high-necked dresses with long sleeves. All kissed the mezuzah as they entered and greeted my mother with a good day or God help. Mother stood by, pale and distraught. Some of the respectable women of the neighborhood had come in and surrounded her like a bodyguard, so that none of the impurity should touch her. But on my father's face I could discern no change of expression. It was as though the tumult did not in any way concern him. He stood at his lectern, poring over a volume and writing notes on a scrap of paper. Everyone else awaited the bride and groom. I stepped out on the balcony and saw a crowd standing on the sidewalks and the courtyard gate. Some of the madams and whores had also come out on the balcony. Suddenly there was a commotion. The couple emerged from one of the courtyards. The groom wore a new overcoat and patent leather shoes. The bride was frail and dark. She looked like a quiet, respectable girl. The women on the balcony quickly pulled out their handkerchief and wiped their eyes. "Just see how pale she is. Is she fasting? Isn't she lovely? May my good fortune shine like her face. May we meet again at your wedding. Go on now, go on. One must never lose hope." In our study, one of the pimps, a giant of a man with one blind eye and a crooked scar across his forehead, began to put things in order. A bewigged madam scolded the women, telling them to stay near the walls. One girl with a pimply face laughed and cried at the same time. This was not simply a wedding, but a performance like those in Kandinsky's theater. We usually managed without a sexton, but the pimps had brought one of their own, a tiny mannequin who belonged to their crowd. The bride entered the room, and the women pounced upon her. They kissed and embraced her, danced with her, refused to let her go. A stream of blessings was poured upon her. She answered each one with the same phrase, "May God grant you the same good fortune." This wish called for a stifled sob from each of the women. My father sat down to write out the marriage contract. This, however, presented an awkward problem. Father conferred in a whisper with the sexton. He referred to one of his rabbinic tomes. It was senseless to write that the bride was a virgin, but then neither was she a widow or a divorcee. What the solution was, and whether the bride's portion was put down as 200 tzutzim, the traditional portion of a virgin, or less, this I do not remember. 4 men took hold of the poles of the wedding canopy. Both bride and groom were orphans, and so their escorts to the canopy were uncles and aunts. All was done in accordance with the prescriptions of the law. The groom was wrapped in the traditional white linen robe. The bride's face was covered with a kerchief. My father pronounced the blessings and let the bride and groom take a sip of wine. When the bride put forth her index finger and the groom placed the ring on it, pronouncing the verse, "Behold, thou art sanctified unto me," all the women began to sob.